This is the Horten Ho-Two-Two-Nine jet fighter bomber. It was intended to be one of Germany's superweapons.
For 80 years, the blueprints of Nazi Germany's most advanced aircraft were lost, scattered, incomplete, and buried by time. Now, a quantum-powered artificial intelligence has done what no human could. From broken sketches and fragments, it rebuilt the Horten Ho-Two-Two-Nine. A flying wing so far ahead of its time, it seemed impossible. What it revealed shocked even seasoned aerospace engineers. The last surviving Horten jet. Walk into the Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia, and you'll spot something that looks like it came straight out of the future. It sits there, dark and sleek, like a metal manta ray resting on 3 landing wheels, with its long wings stored nearby. That strange shape is the Horten Ho-Two-Two-Nine V3, the only surviving airframe of the world's first jet-powered all-wing aircraft. You can walk right up to it inside the Boeing aviation hangar, peek into the cockpit, look through the engine bays, and even see the detached wings up close. It's a one-of-a-kind survivor from the final months of World War II, carefully preserved by the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. The story of this aircraft begins with 2 brothers, Reimar and Walter Horten. Long before the jet age, they were already obsessed with tailless flying wings. They started out building gliders between the wars, trying to prove that airplanes didn't need a tail to stay stable. When World War II sped everything up, they turned that wild idea into something much bigger, a jet-powered warplane. In 1943, Germany's air chief, Hermann Göring, gave the brothers the funding they needed. Their mission was built around what was called the 3x1000 goal: carry about 1,000 kilograms, or roughly 2,200 pounds, of bombs, fly roughly 1,000 kilometers, or about 620 miles, and reach a top speed near 1,000 kilometers per hour, which is around 620 miles per hour. Those numbers set the tone for what the Hortens built between 1944 and early 1945. Even though the war ended before the plane ever saw combat, each prototype got a simple label. The first one, the V1, was just a glider with no engines. It took off for the first time in the winter of 1944. The next, called the V2, added 2 Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines and made its first powered flight on February 2, 1945. It flew again a few days later, but rough landings forced repairs. Then, on February 18th, during its 3rd flight, tragedy struck. The test pilot, Erwin Ziller, was killed after an engine failed, and the aircraft went down. That crash ended all flight testing. Plans were already underway for more airframes, including the V3, which was still under construction with its engines built right into the center of the wing. But none of those later versions ever reached the runway. The V3 is the one that survived. In April 1945, U.S. troops founded at the Gothaer Wagenfabrik factory in Thuringia, where the Hortens had moved production as the war collapsed. American forces packed it up with other captured German technology and shipped it back to the United States. By about 1952, the aircraft, along with several earlier Horten gliders, became part of the Smithsonian's collection. But space was limited, so the center section spent decades in storage, sometimes even outdoors, before conservation teams finally began a deep study in the 2010s. Moving it from storage to public display was a massive effort. In 2013, the museum began planning the transfer. Engineers built a custom steel cradle to hold the fragile airframe steady for the 40-mile trip from the old Garber facility in Maryland to the restoration hangar at Udvar-Hazy. The move happened in 2014, and for the first time, visitors could see the V3 up close, its center section standing on its landing gear, with the wings staged nearby. Up close, you can really see what the Hortens created. The center section is built from welded steel tubing, wrapped in layers of laminated plywood. It stands about 9 feet tall, stretches around 25 feet long, and with the wings attached, the full aircraft would have spanned about 55 feet. 2 Junkers Jumo 004 B2 turbojets were meant to sit side by side in the center body, their exhausts venting under the trailing edge. The landing gear was a retractable tricycle setup, and the cockpit sat neatly on the aircraft's center line under a small framed canopy. Control surfaces, like the elevons, spoilers, and split drag rudders, were placed out on the detachable wing panels. Altogether, it was a sleek blended design with no tail and no separate fuselage. Just one smooth sweeping wing holding everything together. What's striking is how refined it looks. The plywood skin, though thin, was carefully curved and layered. The steel tubes were cleanly welded and reinforced with triangular braces. Even the access panels and fasteners show neat, logical craftsmanship. When you open the gear doors, you can see how the builders tried to keep everything flush with the airflow. But decades in storage took their toll. The plywood had started to peel apart in spots. Some paint was flaking. Metal parts showed light rust. For a wooden airframe built in wartime and left exposed for years, that's not surprising. The conservation team stabilized everything just enough to make transport safe and then began taking tiny samples to study what remained of the original finishes. One of their biggest clues came from paint. The outer surfaces had a blue-gray coat added by the U.S. Army Air Forces right after the war for public display. Beneath that, in the hidden layers and along the edges, they found a strange greenish color. Lab tests showed it was a German fire-resistant coating used on wood aircraft late in the war. The wood itself told another story. The main structure used Scots pine, a practical but unusual choice for aircraft. That fit the conditions of the time. In 1945, Germany's resources were running low, and the V3 was an experimental prototype, not a mass production model. There were also burn marks. On the underside of the center section, sharp scorch patterns appear exactly where the twin exhausts would have heated the wood. They're in the right spots on both sides, which means that even if the V3 never flew, the engines probably did run while it was assembled. One document found later even suggested that U.S. personnel at Wright Field considered test flying the jet before deciding against it. We now know exactly what was built, what survived, and how it made its way here. The real mystery that follows is what this futuristic jet might have been capable of. The truth behind the stealth jet. Every time people talk about the Horten jet, the same rumor comes up first: the glue. Back in the 1980s, Reimar Horten claimed he mixed charcoal into the glue to make the airplane's wooden skin absorb radar waves. That single line turned into legend. But when the Smithsonian's conservation team finally tested samples from the real surviving center section, the results told a different story. There was no radar-eating secret mix hiding in the wood. Under the microscope, they found plain old urea formaldehyde glue, the same kind used in plywood furniture and aircraft of the 1940s, with tiny bits of oxidized wood fiber inside. The so-called black particles weren't charcoal at all. They were simply aged wood. If carbon had been added in any meaningful amount, there would be a clear dark layer or a chemical signal that jumped out right away. The team in Washington, D.C. didn't find either. So if the glue wasn't the stealth secret, where did the hard-to-spot reputation come from? The answer is in the shape. The Horten brothers built a plane without a tail. By blending the body straight into the wings, they removed the large flat surfaces that usually reflect radar strongest. Things like vertical fins, horizontal stabilizers, or spinning propellers. Even without fancy materials, that smooth, all-wing design naturally cuts down radar reflections. But there's a catch. A jet's compressor blades, and the air ducts feeding them, reflect radar like mirrors. And on a flying wing layout, those engines sit right up front. From the front or low angles, the shiny compressor faces and intake walls would still bounce radar straight back. So whatever gain you got from the clean shape could easily be lost once you turned the engines on. That's the exact trade-off later engineers studied when they tested a full-scale replica. In 2008 and 2009, Northrop Grumman engineers teamed up with a documentary crew to build a full-size, non-flying copy of the Horten Ho-Two-Two-Nine V3. They placed it on a tall pole at the company's outdoor radar test range in California and scanned it across the same frequency bands used by Allied early warning radars during World War II. This wasn't just a made-for-TV stunt. The technical report from that program details every setup, image, and computer simulation that followed. The bottom line, the replica did not disappear from radar. In those tests, it was still visible, typically from 6 to 20 miles away, depending on which radar band and angle you looked from. Compared to a regular wartime fighter, the radar return was smaller, but not by much. Those numbers make sense when you remember how powerful Britain's radar network had become by the middle of the war. The main chain-home stations could pick up targets nearly 80 miles out when they flew around 10,000 feet, and that was only the early part of a system that kept improving with more frequencies and sharper displays. So, if the Horten shape shrank the detection range from dozens of miles down to just a few, that helped reduce reaction time. But it never erased the signal. It's also important to understand what that replica could and couldn't tell us. The replica was built almost entirely of wood. It had no engines and no heavy steel center frame like the real one in the museum. And of course, there were no spinning compressor fans inside. All those missing parts make a big difference. Steel tubes, turbine blades, and hot exhausts are powerful reflectors, and their absence can make a mock-up look cleaner on radar than a live jet ever would. When you start asking how the Horten actually flew, the truth gets pretty thin. Only one powered prototype ever left the ground, and it flew just a handful of times. The record book is short, and most of what we know comes from secondhand notes and memories. That's why there are no reliable speed charts or climb rates to quote. Modern computer models have helped fill in a few blanks. Using the exact geometry of the surviving jet, aerodynamic simulations suggest the shape was surprisingly efficient at high subsonic speeds. The tests done decades later by Northrop engineers back this up. Their wind tunnel work and radar scans showed that the smooth, blended wing design created less drag than the average propeller-driven fighter and produced radar reflections that shifted predictably as the viewing angle changed. Those tests revealed what it could do in theory, but Germany had already drawn up how it would fight in reality. Blueprints for battles that never happened. When German engineers started planning to turn the sleek Horten Ho-Two-Two-Nine prototype into a real combat jet, they already had a clear idea of what it should do and how each version would be equipped. The paperwork from the final year of the war calls it the Gotha Go 229, and it lays out several versions in detail. The first was meant to be a fast-day fighter, starting with an A-0 pre-production aircraft, then a main series model built purely for interception. Other versions were planned too: a fighter bomber, a two-seat night fighter, and a photo reconnaissance jet. For the main day fighter, the design revolved around a tightly packed group of guns built into the strongest part of the aircraft, the thick center section where the wing and fuselage blended together. Records from the time describe four 30mm Mk-108 cannons, grouped 2 on each side of the center line. The Mk-108 was a short-barrel weapon that fired a heavy shell, able to rip through bomber formations with just a few hits. Mounting the guns close to the middle kept the structure strong enough to absorb the recoil and made the ammunition feeds simple. The ammo boxes sat right above and ahead of the guns, keeping the belt runs short so they wouldn't jam. Some planners also considered replacing the 4-liter Mk-108 with 2 longer-barreled Mk-103s. Those fired faster and hit harder, but needed more space and added weight. The original order for the aircraft also called for a 1,000-kilogram bomb load, which is about 2,200 pounds. To meet that, designers worked up a fighter bomber version, sometimes called the A2 concept. That setup carried 2 bombs weighing about 500 kilograms each, roughly 1,100 pounds apiece, mounted inside the center section on standard German ETC bomb racks. Keeping the load near the middle puts the weight on the strongest frames instead of the thin outer wings. Some sketches show smaller bombs of around 250 kilograms each, roughly 550 pounds, using the same attachment points. Either way, it used standard racks that could be swapped with those already in service on other German aircraft, like the Messerschmitt Me-262 or the Focke-Wulf 190. Inside that flying wing, space was always tight. There was no long fuselage or tail to hide equipment, so everything had to fit carefully. Engineers balanced the bombs, guns, and fuel tanks through modular planning. The mounting points were built into the frame from the start, even before the wiring or release gear was ready. That way, the plane could carry bombs later without needing to be redesigned. For the night fighter role, designers planned a 2-seat version with onboard radar. Every serious German night fighter in 1944 and 1945 had to carry radar, and this one was no different. Drawings show space for a second crew member and for Liechtenstein-class radar sets such as the Fuji 218 Neptune or the Fuji 220 SN2. Because the Horten had no nose or tail to hang antennas from, the arrays were planned for the front edges of the center section, built into fairings. Behind those panels were spots marked for the radar's transmitters, receivers, power boxes, and indicator screens. The cockpit layout was tight but simple. The pilot sat on the center line, and the radar operator sat slightly behind and to the side with his own small console. The short cable runs between them reduced interference and kept everything easy to reach. German night fighters of the time always followed that tight core layout. You can see the same approach in the Bf-110 and Ju-88 night fighters. The Horten just folded that same logic into a sleeker wing shape. The reconnaissance version worked differently. Cameras had to be mounted where the structure was stiff and the view was clear. On the Horten, that meant cutting small window panels into the belly and sides of the thick center section. That area was solid and stable, keeping vibration low so the photos wouldn't blur. The film magazines, power cables, and heating units sat right next to the camera, so the setup stayed simple. German jets like the R2-2-34 used that same idea. Cameras in the strongest part of the airplane where nothing could shake them. Even if no prototype got the full installation before the war ended, the space for it was already marked out. Because almost everything important sat inside the center section, the layout for maintenance was simple. The gun bay had smooth, flat doors that opened for quick reloading or to clear jams. There were 2 doors on each side for the 4-gun version, and larger ones for the 2-gun setup. The short Mk-108 shells fed easily through the short paths, so reloading didn't take long. The bomber version worked the same way. Standard ETC bomb racks were bolted to the strong inner frames, with short cables running to the release switches. The blueprints ended with the war, but decades later, AI and 3D scanning would help bring the Horten back to life in digital form. The digital resurrection of the Horten jet. At the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, curators don't just see an old airplane, they study every inch of it, using tools that now even include artificial intelligence to help organize and cross-check what they find. The surviving Horten center section and its detached wings have been measured, photographed, and cataloged in remarkable detail. Every fastener, glue line, paint layer, and tool mark that hints at how the aircraft was built has been recorded. That steady, patient work is what makes modern research possible. Those logs become the foundation for everything that follows, from digital modeling to aerodynamic tests, all without ever touching the fragile original. Once the physical details are secured, the aircraft is reborn in digital form. Thousands of overlapping photographs are combined through photogrammetry to create an exact 3-dimensional model, accurate down to the smallest curve. Laser scanners fill in edges and hard-to-reach surfaces. These digital shells are far more than virtual replicas. They are living archives. Each surface can carry notes and data, the kind of glue used along a seam, which paint layer came first, or where later repairs were made. It's an open record that future researchers can explore from anywhere in the world. Those digital models also feed the next layer of study, simulation. Engineers use tools like computational fluid dynamics to visualize how air moves across the Horten's broad wing, showing which areas flow cleanly and which might form drag or turbulence. Another method, finite element analysis, breaks the structure into thousands of tiny points to test how it might flex under stress. These simulations can't recreate the few test flights that happened in 1945, but they can reveal patterns the original engineers never had time to measure. They answer practical questions like where the wing bends, how the control surfaces react, and how forces spread through the frame. These methods, digitization, analysis, verification, form the backbone of a new kind of conservation science, one that quietly benefits from artificial intelligence behind the scenes. Here, AI helps researchers organize complex information, align mismatched records, and detect subtle relationships between data points. The Horten project generates all kinds of material: 3D scans, measurement logs, fragments of old blueprints, and notes written decades apart. AI tools can line those sources up, spot contradictions, and highlight which versions agree most closely with what the museum already knows. When a digital scan and a wartime sketch don't quite match, the software can measure the gap. When a cable path or fastener line fits one drawing but not another, it can flag that too. It doesn't decide what's true. It simply shows where the evidence agrees or disagrees. That helps conservators focus on details that deserve another look under the microscope or camera. But while scientists in the US were preserving the past, Reimar Horten himself was building a new future. Horten's second life. After the war, Reimar Horten didn't give up on his dream of the all-wing airplane. He just changed continents. In 1948, he moved to Cordoba, Argentina, where the government was rebuilding its aircraft industry under new names. That same factory drew in several European engineers who wanted a fresh start after the war. Horten arrived with one goal: to keep proving that a tailless flying wing could really work, not just on paper, but in the air. He began the way he always did, with gliders. They were simple, safe, and perfect for testing his ideas without the extra weight or stress of an engine. His first design in Argentina was the IAE-34 Clenantu, which means sunray, in the local Mapudungun language. It was a 2-seat training glider that took to the sky for the first time on June 20th, 1949. The wings stretched about 59 feet across, with a slim pod for 2 pilots sitting one behind the other. The entire wing carried the load and handled all the control work. No tail, no fuselage. 6 of those gliders were built, and 2 were turned into single-seat racers for the World Championships in 1952. They didn't bring home any medals, but that didn't matter. They did exactly what Horten needed them to do: prove that a tailless airplane could be flown, taught, and repaired by ordinary pilots and mechanics. Next came a more relaxed trainer called the IAE-41 Urubu, also known as the Horten 15C. This one seated two people side by side under a wide, clear canopy, making it easier for instructors to fly with students. It kept the same Horten look: a clean, swept wing with no tail and carefully balanced control surfaces along the trailing edge. Built in small numbers in the early 1950s, the Urubu made its mark in Argentine aviation history when one crossed the Andes Mountains in the mid-1950s. That flight took strong mountain lift, sharp judgment, and a steady hand across long stretches of thin air and high terrain. The success proved that a flying wing could handle real-world challenges, not just short test hops. Some of those Urubu gliders still survive today as part of Argentina's aviation heritage. By the mid-50s, Horten wanted more than gliding. He wanted speed. His next design, the IAE-37, was a bold step toward jet research. It was a pure flying wing shaped like a delta, meant to explore high-speed flight. To test it safely, the team first built it as a full-scale glider. The first flight came on October 1st, 1954. The pilot lay flat on his stomach inside a clear nose bubble, a strange setup designed to cut drag and spread out the G-forces on the body. The plan was to later install a Rolls-Royce Derwent 5 turbojet engine and turn the glider into a jet prototype. But money and timing didn't line up. Argentina's priorities shifted, budgets were cut, and the engine never arrived. The jet project was canceled in 1960. Then came one of Horten's strangest and most ambitious ideas: a flying wing cargo plane built to haul fruit. In the early 1950s, the government needed a way to move produce, like oranges, from western provinces to Buenos Aires quickly, without relying on long, rough highways. Horten's answer was the IAE-38, a tailless transport plane with 4 engines, a wide clamshell cargo door, and pusher propellers mounted behind the trailing edge of the wing. The design called for 750 horsepower engines, but those weren't available, so the team settled for 4 smaller 450 horsepower radials. That downgrade made the plane underpowered, and its huge, tailless shape made handling tricky. The prototype took its first flight on December 9, 1960. It flew only a handful of times before the program was shut down in 1962. The single prototype was later damaged in a fire and eventually scrapped. Horten made Argentina his permanent home. He settled in the peaceful hills near Villa General Belgrano, where he kept sketching and building small-scale prototypes. He worked with young engineers and glider pilots who wanted to learn the art of tailless control. In his later years, he even tried his hand at ultralight designs and wrote papers about the theory behind his work. He died in Argentina in the mid-1990s. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.